Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Rashad. I'm an engineering director at Facebook. I lead our company responsible AI effort, and prior to joining Facebook a year and a half ago, I was at Google for over half a decade, helping Android scale to 3 billion devices. I led Android multimedia efforts, including Pixel camera and the Google Assistant and integration into Android. I would like to welcome you to this panel. I'll be the moderator today, and with me, joining me as a panelist, I would like to introduce you to Elam Tabasi, who is the Chief of Staff at the Information Technology Lab, ITL, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. ITL, one of the 6 research laboratories within NIST, support NIST mission to promote US innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement science, standards, and technology in ways that enhance economic security and improve our quality of life. She will be joined by Igor Jablokov, who is the CEO of Prion, an AI company focused on augmented intelligence. Prion's cognitive technology helps machines better understand people, putting AI at the core of enterprise digital transformation. Impatient with a gap between the invention of AI technologies and their commercialization, Igor left his career at IBM and founded Yap in 2006. Just 5 years later, Amazon acquired the company for its AI technology, which is now found in billions of Alexa, Echo, and Fire TV devices. Both Elam Tabasi and Igor Jablokov will represent the US perspective. With them, as panelists, I'm pleased to welcome Henry Verdi, who is the Ambassador for Digital Affairs for the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Previously, he was the Interministerial Director for Digital Information and Communication Systems of France, and Director of EtaLab, the French agency of MFG Labs, an internet-based startup involved in social data mining, and Chairman of the Board of Cap Digital, the French European cluster for digital content and services. Located in Paris, he is a member of ARCEP Strategic Committee, member of the CNIL Strategic Committee, and also served as member of the board of Paris-Sorbonne University. Finally, last panelist to join us, Alain Pluquet, who is from Merrier. He joined Merrier in 2010 as corporate vice president and became a member of the executive committee in 2011. He has piloted the innovation and created and managed the data analytics unit. He is now vice president of a holding company, Institut Merrier, as Director of Innovation and Technology. He worked previously for the French Alternative Energy and Atomic Energy Commission, CEA, where he was successively in charge of several entities for 10 years in the field of technological innovation, serving various industrial sectors. I'm pleased to be joined by such a great panelist. With now a format, we will then proceed with presentation by each of the panelists. And after that presentation, we'll engage in conversation among each other, and further after that, take questions and answer them. With that, I would like to invite Elam to the floor. Elam, the floor is yours. You may begin your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. I cannot start my video because it says that the host has stopped this. So I don't have any presentations. I will be just talking. So if you can get my video working, otherwise I'll just start. First, I want to thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about NIST AI program. For those of you that you don't know, NIST is home to 5 Nobel Prize winners, and we have a broad portfolio of research from smart manufacturing to material science to bioengineering to cybersecurity and privacy. AI is certainly Sorry, let me just try to get it to work. Yay, it worked. Okay, I'll start. Thanks so very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start by saying a few words about NIST and then get into the AI work that we're doing. I plug in some responses to some of the questions and statements that was mentioned at the previous panel. So National Standards and Technology in the US is part of the Department of Commerce. NIST is home to 5 Nobel Prize winners, and we have a broad portfolio of research from material science to bioengineering, cybersecurity, privacy, all that. AI is certainly a strategic priority for NIST. Within NIST has 6 research laboratory. I am with Information Technology Laboratory, ITL. ITL cultivates trust in IT and metrology by using its measurement and testing resources that encompass a wide range of areas of computer science, mathematics, statistics, system engineers, but also social scientists and even psychologists. In the area of AI, NIST develops tools to measure and understand the capabilities and limitations of artificial intelligence technologies. NIST works with the AI community to establish the technical requirements needed to cultivate the trust that AI systems are accurate, reliable, safe, secure, explainable, and free from bias. We also look into the future computing paradigm beyond the current computing architectures. One thing I want to mention right here is NIST is a non-regulatory agency. We don't write regulations or policy, but we provide technical contributions and evidence for sound policy decisions. As my boss always say, we are not a regulatory, we are a non-regulatory agency, but we are not anti-regulatory either. So the goal of the AI program is to ensure design, develop, acquire, and use of AI is in a manner that foster public trust and confidence while protect privacy, civil rights. And we heard a lot about this in the morning session. Establishing criteria for trust in AI is critical to the next phase of technical advances in many fields, from transportation to energy to manufacturing to healthcare, all the applications that AI can improve and expand innovations. While there has been recent progress in developing principles for trustworthy AI in the public and private sector and around the world, you're familiar with the OECD. We heard about the EU AI white paper this morning. But there is often, and while there is a good overlap and shared understanding and shared value among all of them, there's often a gap between articulating these high-level value-based statements about trustworthy AI and how to turn them into technical requirements that can be used for design, development, use, and test of AI system. I believe Matthew referenced this. So we believe that work is needed around not only the translating those principles into practice and technical requirements, but for each of them around vocabulary, terminology, standards, benchmark evaluations. In this morning, it was mentioned frameworks to support how to align AI system development and AI system outputs and behavior to the stated principles and values, and to give the community the tools to measure and assess the accuracy and performance and trustworthiness of AI systems. So that's the bulk of the work that we're doing, providing the community with a set of toolkits for understanding what constitutes trustworthiness and what are the building blocks of the trustworthiness. We can speak of, and I think Paul also mentioned this morning, these technical requirements encompass things like accuracy. First and foremost, you want your system to be accurate, but also secure and resilient to the different manipulations and attacks and adversarial attacks and manipulations. You want it to be robust so it can perform at the same level that we observe for the training in a real-world operational case. The issue of the explainability was mentioned several times. In some of the applications, you need AI systems to be able to explain how they come to the recommendation or predictions or output that they arrived at. The issue of bias was also mentioned. We want the AI systems to be non-discriminatory, or at least the level of bias should be less than the human biases. Privacy was also mentioned. So the first thing we're trying to do is to figure out what constitutes trustworthy and trustworthiness in terms of some technical requirements that can be designed and implemented and tested in AI systems. And once we have these building blocks, then the work starts on building a shared understanding of what each of these things means. It is often the case that we are talking about the same term, but meaning different things. Certainly, explainability is one of them, bias is another one of them. Once we know what it is that we want to measure, once we have the vocabulary and terminology and taxonomy, and you have a shared understanding of what it is that we want to measure, we can move on to the development of the metrics, assessment, and methods and way to measure each of these technical requirements. I've been keep talking about trust and trustworthiness, but the other side of the trust is the risk. So accuracy is a trustworthiness factor. Error is a risk element. Bias is a risk when objectivity and non-discriminatory is a trustworthiness factor. Resilience is a trustworthiness factor where the risk is the vulnerability. So when I talk about what constitutes of trustworthiness, the other side of the coin is taxonomy of risk. And understanding the risks and coming up with the ways to measure those risks. If we do all of these things right, then we have a good scientific foundations for development of a risk management approach to AI systems. And that is where we hope to, in the help of the whole community, to go to. So on August 6th, we launched this initiative involving public and private sector. We had a workshop. A recording of the workshop is on our website, where we had a discussion around building blocks for trustworthy AI system and associated measurement method standards. It was a well attended and gave us very good information data driver to move on. Then on August 17, we put out a draft of the 4 principles for explainable AI. So in the August 6 workshop, the goal and expected outcome was to understand what are the building blocks of trustworthy AI, and start to moving on to define them. Come up with some measurement techniques for them, and also how their trade-off, how they affect each other. Then we followed up with pursuing understanding of each of those technical requirements or building blocks. On August 17, we released a draft of 4 principles for explainable artificial intelligence. It was out for public comment until October 15th. We received a really robust set of comments. The paper presents 4 principles that capture the fundamental properties of explainable AI, and these principles are heavily influenced by AI systems interactions with human receiving informations. We are adjudicating those comments, and we are probably bringing the whole community in discussions on those comments and figuring out the way forward with the paper and expanding the XAI program after the definition get into the measurement. On August 18th, we hosted a workshop to tackle the important and challenging issue of bias in AI. In the morning, we discussed the issue of the bias in data, and in the afternoon, the bias in algorithm. A summary report, a expanded summary report of that workshop that goes beyond the discussions of the workshop, certainly informed by the discussion of the workshop, but also trying to map the touch points of bias in the life cycle of AI systems, should go out before the end of this year. Last year, we put a paper on terminology and taxonomy for adversarial machine learning out. We're finalizing, again, it went out for a public comment. A really robust set of comment was received. We're finalizing that paper, but in October, we start working on building a test bed for assessing vulnerability of the AI. More on that, we will put some document out around that too. Summarizing up all that, at NIST, we are working hard on measurement standards, evaluations, and related tools for trustworthy AI. We're doing them like any other activities that we do at NIST as a collaborative enterprise, working with the companies, industry, universities, other government agencies, international engagement, nonprofit organizations, we welcome collaborations and coordination with everybody around the globe. And we are doing it in our laboratories, trying to advance the research and measurement around that, and also through a special series of the workshops in standard and also in the standard development setting. We participate in the ISO/IEC Subcommittee 42 and other standard settings processes here in the US and across the globe. I want to end by offering a word of caution that while we can and will make some very important advances in those measurement and standard and evaluations, we need to build a solid scientific foundations of well-defined building blocks accepted by the AI community. Timing and is really important. Rushing into development of the evaluations or standards can hinder AI innovations. But also, if you don't do it fast enough, of course, the industry and the community are waiting for answers. The same thing for the evaluations and conformity assessments, that doing that too soon can result in wasted resources and ill-paced user confidence. So we need to take the time to develop the scientific foundations, technical rigor for the right sets of standards and evaluations and specifications. But at the same time, we have to also have flexibility and a sense of urgency to make sure that we bring solutions as soon as possible for the community that needs it. With that, I'll thank everybody for the time, and I look forward to other remarks and the Q&A later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elam, for the great presentation. You touched on many points that I'm sure we'll revisit when we start talking between the panel. I think this area is very nebulous, and I like how you've been able to provide some clarity and some guidance on how you're approaching that at least. Looking forward to the conversation. With that, it'll be my great pleasure to welcome Igor to the floor for his presentation and to continue the US perspective.
So the first step of a US perspective is us even being here. So how fantastic is this being our first talk after the election? Because I think just working with friends on these various issues, nothing is insurmountable. And I love the fact that the program that we have today gives you an industrial perspective, whether from life sciences or tech. Then we talk about how to measure these things, and then we talk about what, if any, regulation is necessary for it. So I'd like to share my screen right now. So it says you cannot share it. There we go. All right, so let me go ahead and take you through some fun facts. So look, in our lifetime, things have gotten better. From a technology standpoint, this is actually a screen from a Cray supercomputer. So we went from this to this. And so it's a lot easier for humans to interact with technology, and we democratized and opened up the aperture of the number of people that can use these vast resources. Now, even with that, many years ago, people like me were very jealous of things like the Minitel and trying to figure out how do we make it even easier for people to consume media and content. And so this was a magazine article from 2005 where I was talking about that we should be able to speak to our televisions and things of that sort. And everybody was laughing at me at the time because saying, hey, nobody in their right mind would have microphones throughout their homes. And so it took a while until we were able to do that. Several years later, I had left IBM, and here I am on stage in 2007, and nobody knows what I'm actually holding in my hand is what would come to be known as baby Alexa. And so we were Amazon's first AI-related acquisition. Before that happened, actually, we had dozens of enterprise and carrier customers. So we were talking to France Telecom and Telefonica and Orange and everybody else in order to get this deployed, because at that time, we were the first AI cloud company, and people were using our hosted speech recognition for a myriad of activities like processing voicemails or mining phone calls or converting audio into text messages so that people wouldn't text while drive, and then certainly for voice searches. So that was a thrill in order to take something that was already well regarded and expansive and turning it into something even more amazing as a product. Now look, from an industrial perspective, everybody feels a lot of heat. They feel like they have to do something to transform themselves with artificial intelligence. Now, why is that? You know, part of the reason is if you actually go back and look at the start of the Fortune 500 and the S&P 500, the vast majority, almost 90% of companies that were in that index when it started, all disappeared. And the reason why they disappeared is they weren't keeping abreast of all of these technological shifts. That's why a lot more of your decision makers are paying attention. And they don't want to become one of the brands from the past that basically just disappear. And so when we think about then bringing AI to the workplace, we think about, all right, we want it to be augmented intelligence, right? I know a lot of times we talk about self-driving cars and trucks and planes and replacing doctors and lawyers and things of that sort. That's not going to happen anytime soon, right? Humans still drive workflows. We are still the center of imagination, of creativity, of insights. We just can't read 1,000 books in one afternoon like an AI can, but human innovation guides the AI in order to perform the work that's valuable to us. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's not enough data scientists to go around, right? And the fact that many people can use iPhones and iPads and all sorts of other devices around their home without having a formal education in computer science, that's a net positive. And so not everybody needs to have a formal education in data science to use this at work. And then lastly, it has to be strategic to an organization, but at the same time, you should be able to start it in a mailroom. It doesn't have to be across the whole enterprise all at once. This is why when you look at the architecture of our cities, we may have an older church next to a brand new skyscraper, and that's okay. Organizations, evolve over time. From my standpoint, I believe that there's still a critical gap in knowledge management in these organizations. That's what I work on. Because if you actually look at why certain business applications weren't adopted in the past, it was too expensive, right? And it took things like Salesforce and even the last platform that I worked on to come in and innovate with cloud computing in order to solve these things. And so the structured data problem was solved by many of these companies by adopting Salesforce CRM and SAP ERP, so on and so forth, manufacturing execution systems, financial systems from Oracle, and others. But still, unstructured data access hasn't been solved, right? And so it's critical actually to solve this because 90% of our business decisions actually get made with unstructured information. Think about that. And so that's what we focused on. We fundamentally believe artificial intelligence is coming to work like crazy because we have to solve the knowledge management problem in unstructured data retrieval. And the reason why AI is necessary in order to solve that is because we have to simultaneously solve the access problem through natural language, and we have to solve the disparate content problem. And so you have to think about all the resources that you have as essentially an oil well, and how do you draw them up to humans and make it human scale so that we can naturally interact with such things. And this is difficult information. Whenever I mention unstructured knowledge, you're thinking, okay, how hard is it to have a paragraph and essentially ask a question and get something back, and drive it as an accuracy score, like our colleague from NIST would tell you. But in reality, this data is very messy and complicated, And so it's the equivalent of finding a single word in a disheveled library. And that's what AI helps. It helps us organize, and then it helps us find the things that we need. Now, that's one good use of AI. Other good uses of AI are like my friend here, who was the first, Brooke Ellison was the first graduate of an Ivy League. She's a professor at Stony Brook now. So these types of AI technologies helped her with accessibility. But they also help with bullying, right? As you all see this Netflix show called Social Dilemma, and how they can amplify certain things that distress children, and whether they have poor, these recommendations are putting inappropriate content in front of them. That's important. This is where the regulators can do a better job, and they are doing a better job, even if we saw in this last election cycle. The fact that even autocomplete, something as simple as autocomplete can turn people's opinions on things in order to think, well, wait a minute, everybody must think the same way if that's what's happening. Or as we talked about, having algorithms that hand people credit ratings. And so, highly regulated industries are the first ones that are looking at explainable AI and how far they're allowed to automate their processes before it gets dangerous. Obviously, we've seen all sorts of backlash on facial recognition and face scanning, on whether or not we deserve jobs, so that we're not properly weighed as individual humans, and all of these biases that we talk about that are all emerging problems. Here's what I foresee. Over the course of the next decade, we're going to spend 5 years just deploying AI into every workflow that we can think of. And then we're going to spend the latter half of the decade repairing all of the unintended consequences that are going to impact the people at work, and also the customers and partners and community members. And so that's why there's this fun TV show now that is drawing some parallels to us developing the thing that eventually became Alexa, which is the things that it's being used for, and by a greater version of the population, had unintended consequences. It's no different with AI on social media or search and things like that. And in some ways now, after we create these tools, we're trying to repair the fact that we never foresaw some of these risks. But in working together, we all certainly hope for a brighter future. Half solving this is at least showing up, and America's happy to be back. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. This is very fruitful. I think we'll have tons of follow-ups given some of the topic you touched on with respect to the use of AI, the risks, and how to approach some of this. With that, it'll be great to start. I'm very happy to also start the French perspective with Henry. Henry, if you're ready, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Yes, I'm ready, but I cannot open the video. Yes, I will. Okay. Good morning, Atlanta. Here is the end of the afternoon in Paris, but I'm very pleased to be with you. As you know, as you did mention, I'm a former entrepreneur, but now I'm a public servant, I'm ambassador. So I will speak from the state point of view, and to jump to the conclusion, I will share with you the French conviction that it's time to think a common ethical framework, and it's time to think about maybe regulation, and that's very important. But of course, I share the very simple and obvious observation that artificial intelligence is a radical innovation of our time, and that will deeply and profoundly transform our society and our capacity to build the future, and that we can hope a lot of big, impressive use of AI, of course. it will transform every aspect of our lives, our cities, our medicine, mobility, transportation, exchange, education, and will affect everyone. But that's precisely why it's necessary to collectively build the ethical principles that should drive AI and its development. And I'm very happy to have this discussion with you today in this Atlantic perspective. And I just want to mention that this issue is more and more relevant because the recent advance in AI in many eras and the growing influence of algorithms in our lives reinforce its place in the public debate. This discussion will be complicated. It won't be easy at the individual and collective level. Maybe we can make the comparison with medicine and biology. It took decades to have the first relevant ethical framework on bioethics. And of course, we need a constant improvement of this framework because technologies and society constantly evolve. It will be the same with AI. So we cannot decide today on a definitive framework. In my opinion, the first necessary step is to ensure that no irremediable harm will be made with AI. It's a modern version of the Hippocratic oath that says, primo non nocere. First, not make harm. This is a necessary prerequisite, and for example, it will conduct government to forbid some criminal use of AI. But we have to mention this. This principle, of course, is not sufficient. It's more proto-ethics than ethics. I see two other proto-ethics challenges. So first, it's about bias. We start speaking about bias this morning. As you know, AI can reinforce existing bias, and sometimes create them. We are speaking about the infamous examples of FaceNet, the Facebook software of facial recognition, about the work of Joy Buolamwini from the MIT. So it can be very dangerous and discriminant, and it's very easy to make mistakes. You know, I did launch a company about big data. I know how easy it is to take your data set and to jump to the conclusion too much. Here, we need more research, more progress about this issue, more standards, and I did appreciate the first intervention, and maybe more exchange of good practice between companies and research, and maybe some standards. The second point is it's a bit different. It's the idea that AI always answers. I had this conversation with Yann Lequin from Facebook, and he told me once that AI is very polite, and AI never refuses to answer. It always answers, even though the question is poorly asked, and even though it only has a few data to answer. And this ability to always deliver and provide answers to policymakers that will jump to the conclusion, even though the question is bad or the data insufficient, makes AI fairly dangerous. So these are just, as I said, proto-ethics principles, but we have to face them. But even if we don't make mistakes, we need a governance of AI and the principles that should govern algorithmic governance. I think that you are all aware of the famous trolley problem, the problem when the car will choose who will die because you have an accident and the self-driving car has to take a decision. Here we have the universal, very ancient ethical question related to whom you will have to sacrifice in a society. But we have another question, whether you accept that the developers of the algorithm make the decision on its own. And in these times of pandemics, we can find a lot of examples of this situation where the designer of the solution make very heavy decision alone. And here, probably we need to define something to be sure that in this kind of issues, we have democratic answers. So from my perspective, we can agree on three very simple principles. The first one is that algorithmic governance should be more democratic, that is more inclusive and respectful of the population concerns and choices. There should not be anything like a black box when it comes to algorithm, and we need to be able to have a public conversation about this kind of choices. Probably we'll have to define something like a collective consent. As you know, the GDPR did introduce a private consent about private data, but about all those collective decisions, we need something also to be sure that the nation, the people did agree on this kind of use. And of course, we need transparency, and we know very well in France that it's not very easy, especially in the context of constant rise of deep learning, because of course, deep learning makes transparency very hard because it focuses on the rules framing the code and not on the code itself. And of course, algorithmic transparency implies to think of governance model. We have a concrete example of this in France because, and I'm pleased to share this experience with you. 3 years ago, the law, la loi pour une république numérique, the law for a digital republic, did introduce a strong ethical principles. This principle says that each time the state uses an algorithm or an artificial intelligence to take a decision about a citizen, first, the citizen has the right to know that we are using an algorithm, and then we have to be able to explain how this algorithm deals. And to be frank, we are still implementing this decision, and it's very, very difficult because we use a lot of algorithms in the tax system, in healthcare, etc., in education to decide in which university you can go, etc. And it's very difficult to document and publish the algorithm. It's very difficult to explain to everyone how it works. And we are still implementing the decision, but that's a very interesting decision. I'm quite finished, but I also want to share with you that if we don't do this, we likely have to choose the path of over-regulation. And we have to start regulating or to start to think about regulation, or we will have to make a very over decision. We have an example. The example is a genetically modified organisms, GMO, and we find its relevance. So we can say that for a long time, no ethical debate took place about these technologies. And companies say that those technologies will be used for beneficial purpose, like vaccines or agriculture in extreme conditions. But they developed this rapidly for other purposes, like, as you know, the Terminator gene or things like this. And social defiance rapidly grew. And when the government and the regulators came into the debate, they took very strong decision in Europe, and maybe too strong decision, but it was because it was too late. So we consider that we need to start discussing, we need to start to look for consensus very early, or people will be very afraid and government will have to take tough decisions. So I just want to share with you that, therefore, France decided to choose a pragmatic and international approach through the initiative called the GPI, Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. We thought a lot about climate change, and we thought about the IPCC for climate. The GPI is a concrete result of an observation. We have to increase our cooperation in order to maximize the benefits of AI for our economies and societies, of course. And this cooperation includes creating an international and multi-stakeholder expertise on AI. The involvement of all stakeholders in this inclusive and ambitious debate, government, civil society, private sectors, academics, experts, seems to us to be a prerequisite and will be the main source of innovation. So we did create this JPI with Canada, US, and 12 other founding members, which are Australia, Germany, Italy, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Singapore, Slovenia, United Kingdom, India, and the European Union. And we work on two crucial actions. First, launching this international conversation on AI, And then, and maybe that's the most important, connecting policy leaders with the best experts on AI. The objective is to permit an upstream dialogue between the best scientific and experts and decision makers, which is a key condition for designing effective responses and recommendations and to cope with current and future challenges faced by our societies. So far, for the first year, we have identified 4 priority topics: responsible AI, data governance, future of work, innovation, and commercialization. And the current crisis has obviously led us to include a focus on how to answer to the pandemic, of course. So to conclude and to sum up, France believes that the only through a collective international multi-stakeholder approach that we states, scientists and companies will be able to build and enforce the ethical principles that should guide AI development and use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. This is great. With that, to continue the French perspective, it would be great to have Alain on the floor. Alain, if you're ready, please.
I think I'm ready. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. And if I do this full screen, still working?
Still working.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So thank you for the kind of invitation. So I will try to illustrate the industry point of view. By no means I will cover all the healthcare industry because we are focused on one segment, which is called the IVD. So IVD stands for in vitro diagnostics, but we have also colleagues in pharma industry, in medical devices, with similar questions, but not exactly the same. So just one slide to show you what we do today. So we are a mid-sized company, mid-sized meaning 3 billion euros in revenue. So we do many things, but what we do the most is IVD, so those lab tests. So you see our customers at the top of the slide. So they are taking human samples, running the test, and providing clinicians with results. So this is our customers. This is what we do been doing for many years. But if you think about it, IVD is also an IT technology because the end product of any lab test is a piece of information that you are providing to the clinicians, and you will use this information to make a decision. So that's why we are very involved in the digital transformation and very interested in the AI evolutions. And I will give you a few examples in a minute. So regarding the topic of the day, which is the ethical aspect of AI, I think it depends a lot on the situation. And I chose 3 examples, 3 different locations if you want to show that. So the first one is quite simple. So this is within the labs, actually the big labs, we call that central labs. To give you an idea, so those platforms are able to process every day something like 500,000 samples. So you can imagine the complexity of that and the importance of a digital backbone for that. So, but this is very industrial. So the processes are in place. This is under very stringent regulations like HIPAA and GDPR and many others. So basically the people are trained and very well controlled. So there is not a big risk actually. So, and on top of that, the AI is not very well present in that field. So we see the first examples, but frankly speaking, this is still very limited. So I give you an example here on the bottom left of the slide. You see this technician. She's looking at images on the screen, and she's trying to identify bacteria on petri dishes. The AI layer is here to help her, for instance, to rank the plate according to some criteria, to count the bacteria on the plate, to pre-identify the bugs, and so on and so forth. By obviously, the final decision is made by the technician, and the AI is just here to help her. So very limited use today, even if people like this guy on the right is asking for more AI because the robotics is in place, but now he wants more, automation on the data side. So still limited, and it's a very controlled world. So the risk, I'm not saying there is not any risk, but it's very limited and very well controlled. So quite simple compared to the next one, which is the hospital, a much more complex situation with patients, nurses, doctors, many people interacting in the hospital. And for sure, if you look at this field, AI is gaining ground with new applications to, for instance, to offload the work or to typically to help clinicians to make decisions. We call that CDS in jargon, so clinical decision support systems. So that's very visible. That said, if you look at the challenges, most of them are related to IT, not to AI. So that's basically a question of data security, data privacy, patient consent, which is completely agnostic to the technology. AI or not AI, that's exactly the same. For AI, the big issues for me are related to two things. One is explainability. So the people want to know why the system is proposing such or such decisions. That's very important for the medical players by training, by history, because all the medical practices are based on explaining what is ongoing. And the other question for me is strongly related to change management and training and education. If you don't control that, you are exposed to potential misuses of the system. So for instance, people starting to use your system with a use which is not the intended use at the beginning. So you are exposing your patient to some risk. Or people that are so happy with the tool that they start to over-rely on the tool and they start to cut some corners, which is quite dangerous. So that's all the main challenge for me. But AI could also be the solution to mitigate those risks. For instance, I took the example on the left of the slide here. This is a system that we deploy now commercially in the US, in Canada, US, and Europe, which is here to help the clinicians to choose the correct antimicrobial drug for the patients, which is very complex because you have many different bugs, many different molecules, many different situations. So typically this tool is a rule engine with something like 2,000 rules that are documented, traceable, and everything. So the benefit for the patient is quite clear because the hospital stay is reduced by 2 days in average, which is huge. And also the savings in antimicrobial drugs is quite significant because it's between 20 and 25%. So what we're trying to develop now is in another layer of AI on top of that, not to complement the tool, but just to monitor the use of the tool in the hospital to see if there is some deviation in the use, for instance, or to monitor some KPIs in the department of the hospital, or to understand why clinicians are accepting or not accepting the recommendation of the tools. So another layer of AI, which is controlling the first AI, which is quite interesting as a tool to be deployed at large scale in different countries, in different settings, for instance. And then the third example would be probably the most complex. If you go to decentralized testing, for instance, what we call point of care, or even home testing or self-testing, which is very fashionable. And this is accelerated by the proliferation of smartphones. There was a strong push with the COVID-19 because people want to be tested at home now, not in the lab. But if you look carefully at the market today, actually very few AI-based point of care solutions are deployed so far. There are exceptions, but this is not the revolution. It will take time. And regarding the challenges, again, most of the challenges are not related to AI. They are mostly related to IT, for instance, or the settings. So, for instance, misunderstanding of the test before the test or for the results, or lack of support from a medical professional, data privacy, cost, and so on. This is not AI specific. What is very AI specific is, again, explainability, in particular for people that are not experts, because if you are talking home testing, for instance, you are not supposed to be an expert in infectious disease, for instance. And of course, there is, as alluded by many people before, there is a potential discrimination due to the bias in the database because the training set could be done with a specific population, and when you deploy a solution in other countries, for instance, your patient maybe not be correctly taken into account in the database, which is quite an issue. So I chose two examples to illustrate my point here. In the middle of the slide, you see what we call a near patient system, which is not an AI solution. It's mostly an artificial stupidity system, basically. It's an idiot-proof, bulletproof system. So for PCR, you can use that for COVID if you want, for COVID-19. But there is no AI by design because we have decided not to do so for a reason of robustness and market access. On the contrary, at the bottom, you see a system which is very interesting. It's a startup called Diaboloop. They are not FDA approved yet, but it will come quite soon, I think. It's a closed loop, so you control the glucose level in your body, and the AI will compute the level of insulin to inject in real time in your body. So that's a very interesting system. But of course, AI is absolutely central in the system. And in any deviation could be extremely dangerous for the patient. So that's two opposite examples. So as a conclusion, and to answer a question asked by the organizing committee, what could be the way to resolve those challenges? I think there are many ways to do that. So first, for the why, I completely agree with Henry Verdi just a few minutes ago, when he said that there is a risk of over regulation. So I think we have to find the right balance between risk and benefit. And sometimes we speak a lot about risk and not that often about value, which is bizarre. But I think we have to find the balance between the two. And there is a balance to find between regulation and over-regulation, maybe, and practices, education, training. If you look, for instance, at the young medical doctors in the US and in Europe, their training about data and AI is very, very limited. So you can imagine that there will be probably not the best advocate for that in their career. So we have to modify that for sure. For the WHO, that's a no-brainer. I think everybody has to be embarked, regulatory authorities, healthcare professionals, patient associations, for sure, academics and learned society, and of course, industry. So probably if you compare US and France, in France, we still have this distance between the public sector and the private sector. There are some exceptions. I would like to highlight the wonderful work of the team called Ma Santé 2022 in France, which is My Health 2022, headed by Laura Le Tourneau and Dominique Pons. They are very, very pushy and very concrete. So they have a specific group related to ethics and data in healthcare, which is quite interesting. For the how, of course, we have to continue to discuss and to interact collectively, for sure. I would like to recommend to do more experimentation and evaluation before the classical way. You develop a product, you go to the FDA to get approved, or you go to see marking. I think we are losing time. I think it would be more interesting to test in real situation before any validation with a clinician, with the industry, with the patient. What could be the use or the good or bad of new solutions before trying to access the market with inappropriate solutions. So those experimentations are not that common. I think we have to invent the place to do that, at least in France and probably in the US. And when you know that healthcare is a very, very slow animal, it takes forever to change practices. So that's one more reason to start now, as we speak. So thank you. And I think with the team of today, we're ready for any questions.
Hello, everyone, all participants. We're ready for questions. Don't hesitate to add them to the chat window. In the meantime, with all this great presentation, there's so much we can talk about, from a very in-depth question, a theoretical question around how you define things like fairness and measure algorithmic bias, to a high-level question around mention of early regulation versus stifling innovation. I would like to ask that to the panel. Essentially, Henry touched on that point that if you regulate too early, obviously we may stifle innovation, but if you regulate too late, you may have to act so strongly that it becomes quite catastrophic for the industry. How do we find the sweet spot? How should we approach it? What is the right balance between regulation and innovation, and what should the timing look like?
I think I can.
Henry or Ala?
I think I can try to concur to the answer. I think for me the question of new solution based on IT and AI is a question number one of adoption by the clinicians, adoption in real situation. I think typically the approaches that the regulatory entities in France, and don't know for the US, but are very theoretical. They are very far, and this is not a criticism, this is a fact. They are very far from the actual situation of the patient, of the clinician, of the profession in the hospital, for instance. So I would recommend to experiment, to try that again in real situations, in a very protected, of course, environment, because it's a special, cases. But the way we do drugs and medical devices and lab tests today is very linear. You develop, you go, you submit your file, you get an answer, you go to market access. This is not going to fly for AI. It's very linked to the use and to the interaction between different people. So if we are not able to invent those new labs or places where we can test that in advance, it would be very difficult to find a sweet spot. That's my point. So experimentation first.
This is. Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I was just going to make a quick comment, because it's a multidisciplinary problem, right? In firsthand, this is an amorphous thing. This isn't a physical product that you can put your hands on and say, does it work or does it not work? The first thing is it's amorphous and hard to tell what's even in there, especially if you're dealing with unstructured information. Structured information, you can move from point A to point B, and that's how our banking system works, and you can regulate. With unstructured content, it becomes a harder problem. And then you have to measure it, and then you have to describe whether you like the measurements that are coming out or not, and then finally regulate the things that are necessary. This is a moving target right now because it's hard to wrap our minds around it.
Yeah, this is I also mentioned that during my presentation, that's actually a fine point, coming up with the right. So we do need something. Obviously, there are all these principles, and everybody is rushing into some sort of regulatory framework and policy making, but we also want those things to be technically sound. So a lot needs to be understood right now, not only on agreeing with all the answers before me also, but not only, for example, in the case of explainability, what we mean by that, but also how do we know if this explanation is good, but also the trade-off that they have among each other, right? So it has been reported that as you increase the explainability, you may get a hit on accuracy. So depend on the application, the use case, the user group, the individuals involved, and the current laws on the book. Everybody, the considerations about choosing the right system so that it give you the level of the explainability beyond the black box that AI systems are. So it's a very fine point, and the good thing, I think, is that there is a lot of discussions, there's a lot of energy and development, and I'm hopeful that as we strengthen this type of discussions and bring our brains and technical work together, the sooner we can address this problem.
Very briefly, because that's a very important question. And of course, we have a wide range of AIs. We have a wide range of issues, of application. If you listen to the social network, you can fear overregulation because people are afraid, but they are also anti-vax, or they are also afraid of a 5G, and I don't know. I don't think that it's time to legiferate. I think it's too early, but it's time to look together to common principles. You know, in bioethics, for example, you have strong principles like the individual, in French we say bénéfice individuel direct individual benefit, or we speak about consentement libre et éclairé, free and enlightened consent. And we need such principles for AIs. So, for example, in the French history, 10 years before the first law, we had President Mitterrand did launch a National Bioethics Committee with researchers and patients and everyone, and sociologists, and etc. And we start to look for such principles. From my perspective, now that's just the time of principles, but we have to start thinking about this.
This is excellent.
If I can add, excuse me, if I can add a geopolitical perspective, but probably at some point we'll have to explain to some countries that we don't agree with some use of AIs, if you see what I mean. And if we don't have strong principles within like-minded, it will be very difficult.
You're talking eastern part of the world? No, okay, far east.
Far east, yes.
That leads me to a question, because I heard about some initiative with the GP AI, which is quite interesting, but has mainly Western countries on board. What role do you think large multinational organizations like the UN should play in that particular effort? As you know, they have organizations that look after a variety of industries. What role should they play in AI, and do you see them as a key player in that space with respect to helping regulate and shape the space?
Very briefly, so it's not Western countries, but it's democracies. You have also Singapore or India, and we totally assume that we wanted a like-minded group of democracies because we want to be part of the conversation as democracies. And then when we have strong position between democracies, we'll be able to have a bigger discussion in United Nations or UNESCO, because they are doing interesting work. And that will be a second round of the conversation, because of course we don't totally agree about the use of AI. We don't totally agree on mass surveillance, for example, or human rights or things like this.
I think the topic of international engagement is a very important one, and not only to make sure that these are harmonized and we are not ending up with some sort of a contradictions, but also the fundamental rights and everything that we want to get with the AI system to make sure that the individual rights and privacies are respected is something global. So it's important. International engagement is important not only to pursue that goal, but also, as I mentioned, to expedite this type of research and technical work that's going on. So the more the merrier, I would say.
Artificial intelligence. I was going to say artificial intelligence paired with quantum computers are the next nuclear weapons. So I mean, it's a fundamental part of great power competition going forward, and you have to treat it as such, right? I know we're talking about industrial uses and healthcare uses and things of that sort, but everybody behind the scenes is paying more attention to it in terms of what happens in the cybersecurity realm. The fact that whoever gets there first is going to be able to turn everybody's lights off. So that's the issue with it.
Okay.
This is
coming back to your question, Rashad, about UN, as a partner to discuss about AI in healthcare industry. That's my angle. Honestly speaking, I don't see any added value because, you know, in the world, you have the main guys are FDA for Americans. Canada is following the same way. In Europe, the CE marking is a copy paste now of the FDA approach, more or less. And even the Chinese for Henri's, the Chinese FDA is, you know, also using the same standard. So I think there are links between those people that they are not aligned, but they talk together. So I think we have enough partners to do it. It's complex enough not to add another one. I would like to have the same, you know, the same rules for any countries because it will facilitate the deployment of the solution in different countries. It is not the case today. In Europe, for instance, all the healthcare systems are different. France is not Germany, Germany is not UK, and so on. Everything which is, you know, facilitating the interaction between those countries is good, but asking the UN to add an extra layer, that's probably too much complexity for us. So let's start with the guy we know. So they are smart people and then they know about the market and what the patient needs. That's good enough.
That's excellent. Still no questions from the attendees. So happy to move the conversation in another direction. There were talk about where AI would go, and less concern about AI replacing high-skilled workers like doctors, lawyers, but more focus on believing that the reality will be more of an augmented AI world. The question I have is, even this augmented AI world, aren't we worried about the acceleration of automation thanks to AI, and therefore having concern about essentially limiting the number of people that will be required, including skilled people, to continue to operate the world as we see it? A, is it a concern? And B, what mitigation strategy should societies and countries have to address this long-term concern?
Well, honestly speaking, today, if you discuss with healthcare professionals in hospitals, in medical offices, we are not there yet. So they are saturated with work and patients. So everything which is helping them to save time to do what they have to do, that's very welcome. So we are not at the stage where you have, augmented diagnostics, and that's not the reality. It will take, years to modify that. So, again, healthcare is a very slow, animal. And there are good reasons for that. You don't change the medical practices every morning because it took time to establish them. It has to take time to modify them. So maybe in 20 years, I don't know, but in the coming 5 years, no way. The AI tools that will be successful will be tools that will help people to do their job as designed today, not more. That's my perception based on experience.
And look at the screen that I shared of that Cray supercomputer. That was 50 years ago. And Bezos even says we're first inning, to use a baseball analogy, of artificial intelligence. We can't even get a robot to pick up an apple. Right. So how is it gonna replace people in however strata that you feel like the skills could be mechanized? Now, are there going to be innovations in different places that will put pressure on different jobs? Of course. Can we actually accurately predict them? No, we can't. Did we all expect in 2020 to have these Teslas, these fantastic new electric style cars? I don't think so. Nobody would have predicted that 10 years ago, and that now we have such things, and it's adding pressure to the whole industry. And then there's other things that we would have expected to have that are more personalized medicine and things of that sort, and we don't have those quite yet. They're still, experimental things. So the things we predict, I always say, all of us here as futurists, here's how I always discount. I'm like, look, 50% of what I said is wrong. The problem is I don't know which half. So.
fortunately or unfortunately, this is so true, and that's what makes it really hard to be forward-thinking, especially in the space of regulation. Henry, you wanted?
Yes, I agree a bit with Alain because, you know, you can make a lot of things with AI and we'll make more and more, but it's always things that computer things. Screening thousands of pictures to find one is a bad use of the brain, and the good use of the brain is creativity, courage, care, things like this. And I don't think that tons of jobs will be replaced by AIs. Maybe I more worry with the drivers, maybe, but we have a lot of other change applying in works because it will break every value chains. It will use the sum of thousands of decisions to make an algorithm, etc. So we predict that we'll have a lot of change in the work, but not so much jobs directly replacing by AIs. It's not like this. But we have to be careful because a lot of things will change.
Yeah, look at the COVID-19, for instance. Have you seen the picture of the clinicians, trying to treat patients in hospitals? Okay, you see the context. Do you think that an AI solution will help them? A super doctor? No way. This is not, the reality of the activity today. But still, there are places for very well-defined tools to for specific tasks to save time and money, not to replace the brains as Henri just said.
That's excellent. When you see the use of this system in recommendation engine, for instance, and in other areas, where they're able to see through an army of content to help classify them, to help enforce integrity rules and things like that. These are essentially things that obviously augment humans, but the reality is that if you translated that in a number of people that you need to be able to make this decision at scale, clearly you see the benefit, but you also see the fact that even in things that require more and more understanding, there is a lot of progress that that at some point impact a high skill level job. But your point on the reality on the ground is well taken. We years ahead of that, and which reality will materialize is hard to predict at this point. Before we conclude, maybe one question from the audience. There was one, I'll read it from an anonymous attendee. The issues of algorithms are very important. In the series of New York Times Rabbit Hole, the columnist Kevin Rose explores how our lives move online. How do the different panelists see the issues of ethics and algorithms in the future?
So I'm confused. It was a topic of the day. So
I know. So I guess
how do we see the impact of AI on?
No, the essentially, how do you see the impact of AI, the issues of ethics and algorithms, which we've covered extensively. So I agree with you, Alain. Maybe for the last question, we should pick a different one.
Well, that's just a comment about it. I think again, back to Earth and to very concrete things. If you try to develop and to deploy solutions for IT and AI solutions in the healthcare system already, I'm not saying that ethics is not part of the equation. Don't say that, but this is not the question number one by far. Question number one is about adoptions, making sure that your tool is efficient, market access, price, reimbursement. So ethics is one dimension, and even if you talk to the professional, the doctor, for instance, they don't speak about ethical problems. To be very blunt, that's not into question. So I'm not very concerned by that. Maybe with a huge deployment of those tools in the future, it could be very important. But honestly, today, I think we have bigger risks to manage on this planet than those risks. That's my point.
That's true. Most likely, from the healthcare industry, if you look at other industry, like today we have billions of Alexa devices in people's home. I'm certain there are some ethical risks associated with how they behave and the implication they may have. But it's very different than the risk you have in the healthcare industry, where you look at how AI is being developed.
Yes, in my field, I spoke in my speech about algorithmic governance. I think that a lot of policymakers start to think with algorithms, through algorithms. So they design rules. They will say, if you are too old, you cannot enter in this room, and if you did make this and this and this, you won't go in the university, and stuff. And I think that it's time to start thinking about how we make democracy in this field of algorithmic governance. And here they will use a lot of tools like the nudge, like personal advertising, like things that marketing industry did invent, but they will apply this to political issues. And I think that it's one of the biggest thing in our times. And maybe that's one difficulty of our panel, because it's not the same to use AI within industry and to use AI to conduct a country. So the issue of algorithmic governance, when the power is invisible and through small decision every time, is a very important issue.
Yeah, I want to second that. And while a lot of activities and attention right now is to get algorithms and systems that work, and of course, accuracy is really important. But for the AI systems and algorithm to gain the user confidence, we ought to be able to address the questions of bias, the question of explainability, the questions of the security. And so when they talk about ethics, I think that, again, one of those words that can mean different things to different people. But when you look at the principles set in OECD, in G20, in GPA, in AI EU white paper, they all are, they're asking for more understanding, more way of figuring out and assuring confidence in the use of AI systems. So I think that's an important topic to handle. And there is a lot of research trying to get into understanding each of them, how to measure them, and what an evaluation of AI systems means. Right now, a lot of attention is just on accuracy, on error rate. But I'm hoping that in future we are looking at the performance as a whole when we consider other technical requirements for trustworthy, as much as it's needed for that use case.
Definitely agree, and I think that particular topic we could spend an hour on it, exploring the various ways. I mean, we don't even have a good definition of how to measure algorithmic bias and what fairness means, and just agreeing on these basic things are extremely complicated, and developing the tools and technologies to measure that at scale are for sure challenging. We're unfortunately running out of time. Actually, we just scratched the surface of a topic. I mean, we could go at it for hours and things that are super deep and more complex. I would like to thank all our panelists today, Ilham, Igor, Henry, and Alain for fantastic presentation and for the conversation. I'd like to turn the floor now to Jason for the concluding remark. Thank you very much, everyone. It was a pleasure, and I was happy to host that.